Hi Robert, thank you for this interview with us. Can you just tell me briefly about your role?
Well, I'm Professor of Social Work at ACU, and that's responsible for the social work programs across the 3 campuses at the university, so at Canberra, Strathfield and in Brisbane.
It's a big job.
Mm.
And for a long time you've worked in the area of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could tell us what have been the major changes to mental health service systems that you've seen during your working career?
I think probably the most obvious one is a movement away from the isolation of people with mental illness in specific psychiatric hospitals to a much more mainstream kind of treatment of people with mental health problems. So dealing with acute treatment in the public hospitals, much more emphasis on primary care, so people being cared for by GPs and also by other allied health professionals in the community. I had a conversation with Marinda Epstein, who's a very high-profile consumer advocate, about this just this week, and she was saying that there's probably very little change in the private sector in the way in which mental health services are provided. So relying on private hospital admissions, private psychiatry, private one-on-one kind of care has probably not changed very much. But certainly within the public system, there's much more an emphasis on primary care, on multidisciplinary team, on care in the community rather than care in specific psychiatric hospitals.
So how have these changes impacted upon people experiencing mental illness?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we've seen a big investment of the Commonwealth in spending in mental health, and so they've spent a lot of money on both acute treatment settings but also in recovery kind of focused services in the community. Ironically, I think the experience for people with severe mental illness at the acute treatment end is probably poorer than it has been. I think there's a real shortage of inpatient care for people and a real push to get people out of hospital, and so inpatient care for people in the public system I think is harder to get. And so in some ways you can say we've spent all this money and we've made all these developments, but in some areas of mental health things are not good. In the recovery-based services that are largely provided by the NGO sector, there have been major and significant improvements. Recovery-focused care, looking much more at the way the illness impacts on people's lives, so their housing, their income security, their relationships, their safety, their physical health, their family. All of these things, which are the focus of the recovery-based services, I think have made a significant improvement to the long-term care of people. That acute end, I think, is still problematic.
So what mental health system reforms would you like to see?
I think the big divide in mental health is really between the private sector and the public sector. And for people with serious depression and anxiety who are treated well in the private system, because those admissions are kind of easily organised and people get good care, that care isn't available to people in the public system. So I think what we actually need is perhaps more spending in the area of acute care to be able to extend that beyond the fairly narrowly defined group of disorders that get inpatient care at the moment. So that's one thing I'd like to see, a bit more inpatient care. The services themselves are very, very stretched, the acute services, and they have to make really hard decisions about admitting and discharging people. And I've noticed over the years that the level of acuity in the public hospital system is much higher than it was. So people have trouble getting into hospital, they have trouble staying in hospital. Once they get there, they tend to be moved out very quickly. That's not the case in the private system. It's easy to get in. Sometimes it's hard to get out in the private system because people become well supported and stabilised, and so moving out of that safe place is harder for them. So I'd love to see that kind of evened up. I think we also need a different approach to education and training for the mental health workforce, so that it's much more it's much more able to engage people in the reality of their mental illness, rather than necessarily with fairly rigidly defined evidence-based approaches and fairly rigidly defined clinical approaches. So this whole emphasis on clinical reasoning, evidence-based, fairly defined and prescribed treatments is at some cost, I think, to a more humane and more humanitarian kind of approach to working. So one of my goals when I'm working with students is to try and help them to adopt a much more holistic and much more humane approach to their work, so that there's not this big kind of separation between the worker and the patient or the client, how we define that. And we really aren't getting family care right either. And it's been around for a long time. It's lived in various places. It's gone through different reforms. Every time we have an inquiry, there's a sort of a cry for more involvement of family. We still haven't got that right. So I'd really like to see much more of a comprehensive family approach to acute care.
Mm. And we really, it's difficult for us to think about mental illness without thinking about stigma.
Mm.
And I wonder if you could briefly describe stigma.
You know, it's such a hard concept to get your head around it, and I think it's probably easier to start off by saying what I don't think it is. Because I think that you know, these anti-stigma messages that says you know, people with mental health problems are no different from everybody else, and that's absolutely true, and there's no disputing that. I think what stigma does is to impose a set of expectations, and very negative expectations, around the application of a label. So as soon as a label is given, a diagnosis is given, a judgment is made about that person, and a whole lot of very negative things apply to that person who is very low expectations of dangerousness or unpredictability. All these things, I think, very, very unhelpful. At the same time, I think the message that people with mental health are the same as everybody else isn't the whole story either. It's partly, it's a truth that we hang on to, but the competing truth, I think, is that people with mental health problems have often had experiences and continue to have experiences which really make them very different, and make them feel very different, and which separate them very clearly and very directly and very powerfully from the rest of the community. So we have to hold those two things together at the same time. The people with mental health problems are the same as everybody else, but there's also some important things that we need to understand about the way in which illness does isolate and separate people and make them very different. The New Zealanders have been much more interested in discrimination than in stigma, and saying, you know, we have to make sure that our legislation, that our procedures, the way we deal with people doesn't discriminate against people with mental health problems. So rather than putting a lot of energy into public education, they put more energy into protecting people's civil liberties, which I think is a much better approach.
Mm. So how and why are people experiencing mental illness stigmatised?
In all sorts of ways. We've recently had issues around insurance, people not being able to get travel insurance, for example. It's a good example of discrimination that's not perhaps stigma. I think the expectations, the low expectations, and the kind of fears of dangerousness and unpredictability that attach to it, as soon as media reports of people committing violent crimes, the conflation of that with mental illness is very, very powerfully stigmatising for people with mental health problems. At the same time, the sort of argument that says people with mental illness are not dangerous. That's not quite true either, because mental illness affects everybody, or can affect anybody, and violent and aggressive people who become mentally ill are dangerous. It's perhaps not their mental illness that makes them dangerous, but the combination of those things makes them dangerous. So we again, it's a very painful, very difficult conversation to have, and there's so much that we need to acknowledge, so that people with mental illness are much more likely to be victims of violence than they are to commit violence. People with mental illness are much more likely to be homeless. They're much more likely to be physically ill. They're much more likely to be lonely. They're much more likely to have no income and to be very, very poor. So, we need to kind of have this much broader understanding, I think, of the impact of illness on people. I don't think one of the anti-stigma things is about saying, 1 in 5 people in the population will have mental illness. I actually think that's not very helpful. It's actually not true. 1 in 5 people might experience some form of mental health problem, but I don't call that mental illness. And it certainly doesn't help, I think, to kind of minimise and generalise that experience of severe mental illness, which is very, very different and very separate from ordinary kind of depression and anxiety. And if you're counting it all as the same thing, I don't think that's helpful.
Mm. So how can health professionals avoid perpetuating stigmatising attitudes, beliefs and behaviours towards people experiencing mental illness?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's been quite good research to show that when you talk to consumers about sites of stigma and discrimination, they identify the mental health workforce as one of the most stigmatising and discriminating groups that they deal with. So people with mental health problems encounter that kind of negative thinking, judgmentalism, generalisation about people with mental health problems. So we really have a lot of work to do to try and turn around those very, very negative. For me, it's really about the ability of workers to other people with mental health problems, and to see them as somehow different and not like us. And the business of helping is about doing to people from a position of power and expertise. And really what we want is much more a sense of people connecting around their own shared humanity, recognising that each person that we see has a unique set of skills and abilities and strengths, as well as an identifiable set of problems that brings them into contact with us. And if we can enter that space of helping, much more open to people, much more open to their strengths, much more open to their humanity from our own perspective, then we're much more likely to form helpful, healing relationships with those people. And the message from the consumer movement over the last 20 years is that mental health workers need to start with an understanding and a value of the lived experience of mental illness with people. So we enter that connection with a respect for people's experience as a starting point. And the second thing is that we need to value the healing power of relationships, that people will grow, they will heal through the relationships that they'll make, not just with workers, but with their families, with their friends, with other people. And we need to be to hold on to those two truths very, very strongly. They sit beside all the stuff about evidence-based and effective interventions. I'm not denying the importance of that, because that's basic too. But this is what's valued by consumers and families. And I think we need to embrace those ideas very bravely and very strongly.
Thank you, Robert.